Hey guys, welcome back to my channel Sociology with Mahima. In this video, we will discuss the question 1 of MSOE-1 IGNOU Assignment of this term. So the question is, define education and discuss its nature and scope in a cross-cultural perspective. Chalo फिर let's understand this. When we talk about education in a cross-cultural perspective, we must first understand that education is much more than schooling or formal instruction. At its core, education is the process through which a society passes on its knowledge, skills, values, beliefs, and way of life to the younger generation. Every society, whether traditional or modern, needs some way to prepare its members for adult roles and for meaningful participation in social life. Education is the main means through which this preparation takes place. However, it is important to remember that education is not the same everywhere. It varies from culture to culture, from one historical period to another, and according to the needs of society. Educational ideas did not develop randomly. They have evolved out of humanity's struggle for survival, enlightenment, and social organization. Early human societies educated their members in hunting, farming, rituals, and social customs because these were essential for survival. As societies became more complex, education expanded to include writing, philosophy, science, religion, and administrative skills. This shows that the scope of education keeps changing with social needs and historical conditions. Therefore, to truly understand the nature and scope of education, we cannot look at it from one cultural or social viewpoint. A cross-cultural perspective helps us see how different societies define education, what they value, and how education reflects their way of life. In this way, education appears not as a single universal model, but as a dynamic social process shaped by culture, history, and human needs. If we look at education from a cross-cultural point of view, it became clear that education always grows out of social, economic, and cultural conditions of a particular society. There is no single universal model of education that fits all civilizations. While Western civilization has strongly influenced modern education, especially in countries like the United States, it is important to understand that world education history is not limited to the West. Many non-Western civilizations made equally rich and meaningful contributions to educational thought and practice. For example, the Maya civilization developed highly advanced knowledge in fields such as architecture, astronomy, and mathematics, along with a complex writing system based on logographs. Similarly, in ancient China, education was deeply shaped by Confucian philosophy, which emphasized moral discipline, social harmony, and respect for hierarchy. These examples show that education across cultures served different purposes depending on societal needs, whether religious leadership, scientific knowledge, or governance. A cross-cultural understanding of education helps us recognize that educational systems are shaped by history, values, and power structures, and that no single civilization holds a monopoly over educational development. Education is equally visible in indigenous and tribal societies, though it appears in non-formal and informal forms. In hunting and gathering communities, for instance, education was closely linked to everyday survival. Boys were gradually taught skills such as hunting, tracking animals, and making weapons, while girls learned food gathering, preparation, and other activities essential for sustaining the group. This learning did not happen through writing instructions, but through observation, imitation, and guided practice within the community. Similarly, in agriculture societies, children learned by actively participating in farming life. From a young age, they were involved in preparing the land, sowing seeds, caring for crops, and harvesting. Through this participation, they acquired practical knowledge as well as values like cooperation, patience, and respect for nature. Education here was not separate from life, it was life itself. What is important to understand is that these learning processes were deeply embedded in the community's beliefs, morals, arts, and customs. shaping both skills and character. In the absence of formal schools and writing text, knowledge was passed on orally by elders through songs, stories, proverbs, riddles, and rituals. These oral traditions carried not only practical information but also moral lessons and cultural identity. Such forms of education effectively prepared children for adulthood, social roles, and responsibilities within their society. Therefore, indigenous education should not be seen as inferior to formal schooling. Rather, it represents a different but equally meaningful way of educating individuals according to the needs and values of their society. If we look at ancient Greece, education was not centered on formal schools in the way we understand them today. Instead, it was deeply connected with participation in culture and public life. Works like Homer's Iliad and Odysseus were central to Greek education. These epics were not just stories, they taught moral values, ideals of heroism, courage, honor, and a sense of cultural identity. Young Greeks learned what it meant to be a good citizen by engaging with poetry, drama, philosophy, and public discussion. Education was seen as a form of liberal education meant for self-development and for preparing individuals to fulfill their duties toward the state. However, it is important to note that this educational ideal was limited to free men, while slaves and most women were excluded from it. Over time, the emergence of the sophists brought a significant change in Greek education. They offered instruction in rhetoric, reasoning, and public speaking to a wider section of society, not just the aristocracy. This made education a tool for social mobility, as individuals could improve their social and political position through learning. In ancient Rome, education had a more practical and political orientation. The main aim was to produce effective orators, administrators, and statesmen who could manage public affairs. Romans valued knowledge of law, history, philosophy, and rhetoric because these were essential for participation in public life. Yet, much like Greece, Roman education largely remained the privilege of the elite, reflecting the social inequalities of the time. During the Middle Ages, education became much more organized and formal, mainly under the control of the church. Learning took place in monasteries, cathedral schools, and later in the early universities. Education during this period was largely scholastic in nature, which means it tried to reconcile faith with reason. Thinkers believed that truth could be reached through religious beliefs as well as logical reasoning, and therefore teaching focused heavily on theology, philosophy, and deductive reasoning based on accepted religious texts. Knowledge was not meant to be cautioned freely but understood within a religious framework. With the coming of Renaissance, there was a clear shift in the purpose and spirit of education. Education moved away from being God-centered to being human-centered. Humanism became the guiding idea, and greater importance was given to classical Greek and Roman literature, art, history, and philosophy. The aim was to develop a well-rounded individual with refined manners, cultural awareness, and intellectual versatility. Subjects like rhetoric, poetry, and moral philosophy gained importance, as education was now seen as a way to shape personality and prepare individuals for public and diplomatic life. The Enlightenment brought another major transformation by placing reason, science, and critical inquiry at the heart of education. Thinkers of this period believed that knowledge should be based on observation, experimentation, and rational thought rather than tradition or authority. Education began to encourage questioning attitudes, independent thinking, and scientific methods. This period also promoted ideals such as equality, individual freedom, and intellectual autonomy, influencing modern educational systems that value rationality, progress, and universal access to knowledge. So, if we look at education as a whole, it becomes clear that its nature and scope are never fixed or universal. Education always develops within a particular cultural and historical setting. and it reflects the needs, values, and priorities of that society. In some societies, education focused on survival skills and moral training. In others, it prepared individuals for religious life, state administration, or intellectual and artistic pursuits. This shows us that education is not just about schools or books, but about preparing individuals to live meaningfully within their social world. Therefore, education should be understood as a dynamic and culturally embedded process that changes as societies change, rather than a single uniform system applicable everywhere. That's all for today's class. If you like the class, please hit the like button. Thank you. See you in the next video.